Let's start with Seymour Hersh article in about the sabotage of Nord Stream pipeline. The timing in this article is so important because we know that in December last year, oh, 2021, Putin sent two letters to NATO headquarters and Biden administration. At the same time, the Biden team, Jake Sullivan, he was planning this sabotage, these explosions. How do you see this? When we continue in March, they started again to negotiate, but the plan was already they were determined to do this. So that's I think that's why the negotiations were failed. They didn't want the negotiations. How do you see the timing of these events?
No, I agree 100%. Look, first of all, just let's focus on what you were talking about in December. Right now there is a popular narrative that says that Russia carried out an unprovoked act of aggression against Ukraine when it initiated the special military operation in February of 2022. But just look at December. Who was doing what in December? Russia had just come off of 8 consecutive years of trying to get the Minsk peace agreement implemented. Russia was opposed every step of the way by Ukraine and its allies, Germany, France, the two nations that helped negotiate Minsk, and the United States. Joe Biden had promised in June of 2021 when he met with Putin in Geneva that Minsk would become a top priority. He lied. It wasn't a top priority. Shutting down Nord Stream was a top priority. That's been a top priority of the United States for many, many years now. Ever since Nord Stream 2 was conceived, we've been saying we're going to shut it down. And this transcends administrations. The Trump administration prior to that were saying they were going to shut it down. The Obama administration was not happy about Russian gas going to Germany. So this isn't a Biden policy. This is an American policy. So when Russia is doing one last gasp effort to avoid a conflict by putting forward 2 draft treaties, not to compel the West to sign, but to encourage the West to read and discuss. That's all Russia was asking for. Read and discuss. The United States ignored it. And now, thanks to Seymour Hersh, we know one of the reasons why. Because the United States was looking for a confrontation. The United States needed a confrontation because a confrontation would give the United States, in their mindset, the justification for taking out Nord Stream. They needed Russian tanks to cross the border. And how do we know that? Because on February 7th of 2022, Joe Biden said just that. If Russian tanks cross the border, I will take out Nord Stream 2. Olaf Scholz was standing right next to him, didn't say a word. The look of shock on his face was unreal. It took a German journalist, a female, to actually have more courage than the German leader, a male, when she said, how could you do this? This is German. And Biden, again, gave a confession. We're going to do it. Now we move forward to March. The Russian tanks have crossed the border. But the plan is just a plan. It hasn't been implemented yet. We don't have the pieces in place. And those dirty Russians, how dare they try to stop the war soon? How dare they enter into negotiations? How dare they try to sign a peace deal that would terminate the war on 1 April? That had to be stopped. So the United States sends in Boris Johnson, who pulls the plug. And I think people need to reflect on that too. This war could have been over on April 1st. There would have been thousands of deaths, but not hundreds of thousands of deaths. All the people that were displaced would be home right now. All the jobs that were lost would be earning paychecks. All the infrastructure that has been destroyed would be up and not needing to be rebuilt because it's there. Life would be normal. Kids would be going to school. There would be heat in the homes, electricity in the houses. All that's gone because Joe Biden needed to blow up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And he finally got the opportunity to do it. They put the explosives in place sometime in July. And in September, he sent the buoy in, according to Seymour Hersh. Appropriate frequencies were generated, and at least 3 of the 4 bombs blew up, destroying 3 of the 4 pipelines. The timing you know,
But we
it
have to
can get
consider, Scott, we
bad.
have to consider the counterattack in Kharkiv. Because this comes right after that Putin announces that he's going to send more troops to Ukraine.
No, I mean, look, from the Biden perspective, and I've made this case all along. Joe Biden knew in September that Ukraine had lost the war. It was clear. It was clear to me. I've been saying that, but other people like to believe the lies. But Joe Biden lives in the real world, and he was briefed in September. I'm certain of it. What I already knew, that Ukraine had run out of everything, that they had expended their reserves. There were no reserves left to give them. There was no more manpower. There was no more equipment. There was nothing. And most importantly, there was no ammunition. Ukraine was running out of ammunition, and the West is desperately looking for additional stocks, and they can't find them. Joe Biden knew in September that it was over. Russia just mobilized 300,000 reservists. So he blew up the pipeline. Plus, you also have to remember at the time of the pipeline explosion, the population of Germany was starting to get restless. There were demonstrations in the street demanding that Germany turn on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And so rather than let the Germans turn it on and further complicate efforts to shut it down, I think Joe Biden launched a preemptive attack just to take Nord Stream right off the table.
And your friend Ray McGovern and Jeffrey Sachs, they were briefing UN Security Council on the Nord Stream pipeline. And there are two sides to this story. We have United States on one side and Russia on the other side. United States was 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 happy with Denmark and Sweden doing the investigations, but Russia is not happy with that. And we know that there were a bunch of countries that they wanted an impartial committee to investigate this. How do you see this?
Well, I mean, I've always operated under the premise that innocent people encourage investigations. Innocent people encourage thorough investigations. Innocent people aren't afraid of the facts. But who's shutting down the investigations? Who's putting the pressure on? The United States, which tells the United States isn't innocent. The United States did it. And the other thing it tells you is that Europe knows the United States did it. Because when these files of the investigations are sealed, what the public is told is that the information cannot be released because of the political sensitivity that would, if the release of which would bring harm to the national interests and security of the nation in question. Do you think for a second that if that this information showed that Russia did it, that they would be silent? If they had the proof of Russian guilt, they would be silent? No, they'd be screaming it at the top of their lungs. They would be publishing everything they had to demonstrate Russian guilt. They aren't, which tells you Russia is not guilty. The United States is guilty. And that's what I think of that.
Scott, another thing, Germany had spent $200 billion last year to subsidize energy prices. And yet you hear nothing, simply nothing from the German government to show some level of curiosity to what happened to their energy infrastructure. Do you think the whole NATO system is, it seems to me they are, to some extent there are colonies. They're not, this is not an alliance. How do you see this?
Well, I mean, that's a leading question, but I happen to agree with it. You know, NATO is not a genuine defensive alliance. It stopped being. I mean, some people would question if it ever was a genuine defensive alliance. If you go back to the origins of NATO, the first Secretary General, a guy named Lord Ismay, gave a famous quip that the purpose of NATO is to keep the Germans down, the Russians out, and the Americans in. There's nothing in there about a defensive alliance. It's a mechanism of European control. It's how the United States controls Europe. And it's always been that way. During the Cold War, there was never a legitimate threat of a Russian attack against the West until the military capabilities of the West during the 1970s and the post-Vietnam era began to build, and Russia began to be concerned about the potential of a NATO first strike. And so that's when Russia revamped its war plans and came up with a plan in the late 1970s to reach the Rhine River in 6 days. But again, people look at that and say, see, proof the Russians were a threat. I'm like, no, that's the proof that you were the threat. And that was the Russian counter to your threat. NATO is not a defensive alliance. NATO is a mechanism of control. And we know this because we take a look at how the United States has used NATO in the post-Cold War environment. Uses a mechanism of offensive military operations against Serbia, uses a mechanism of offensive military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya. And today, NATO is involved in a proxy conflict in Ukraine that has nothing to do with, defense of the alliance and everything to do with the aggressive overexpansion of NATO. Remember, the Russians were promised in 1990 there would be no expansion of NATO, none whatsoever. In 2008, William Burns, then the U.S. ambassador to Russia, today the current CIA director, made it clear that the Russian position on NATO expansion in Ukraine was no. No means no, yet means niet was the memorandum. And it foretold the problems that we're facing today. You can't say that what the Russians did took the United States or NATO by surprise when the Russians moved in on Ukraine in February, because we were provoking them the whole time. We were the ones provoking this crisis. We were the ones making the inevitability of Russian action I think, everybody should look at NATO right now and ask just the basic fundamental question, why? Why does it exist? And if you can't articulate a logical reason why, then maybe it's time we do away with NATO.
If you take United States out of NATO, you see a bunch of toothless tigers. They can, you are a military expert. You know that. Do they have anything to say if United States is out, Turkey is out? Do they have any capability militarily?
Even with the United States in, they don't have any capabilities. NATO is incapable of fighting the kind of war that's being fought in Ukraine today. NATO can't sustain the rate of artillery expenditures. NATO doesn't have enough tanks. NATO doesn't have enough trained men. NATO doesn't have anything. Their militaries are jokes. One by one, it's starting to come out that the British Army would run out of ammunition in a matter of days. The German Army would not be able to get out of the barracks. The French Army would be dead in a week. Even the American troops, as good as they are, there's not a sustainability factor. The General Cavoli, the head of the U.S. forces in Europe, the Supreme Allied Commander, recently said in the presentation to Sweden that the scope and scale of the violence ongoing in Ukraine was beyond the imagination of NATO. And so if NATO can't even imagine it, that means they haven't prepared for it, not trained for it, equipped for it. NATO cannot fight Russia today, cannot. And it's even worse for their aircraft. Everybody's saying, well, wait a minute, okay, we understand the ground forces might be bad, but, institutions like the Royal United Services Institute, the British military think tank, have come out and straight up said that NATO's air forces would get shot out of the sky day one, that they don't know how to operate in the environment that exists in Ukraine, where the Russians have sophisticated integrated air defenses. They have fighter aircraft that can shoot down the NATO aircraft at long distance. I think the air war would be over before it barely started, because the moment the planes take off from their bases in NATO, they're almost within radar range of the Russian air defense radars, and they're going to be picked off, killed, destroyed. NATO's got nothing except nuclear weapons. And of course, if we use nuclear weapons, then
Yeah, everybody
the world has because we're all dead.
And the other day, Boris Johnson, in response to a journalist, said, I'm quoting him, I'm a little concerned that the atmosphere in Washington is change. It may change if Ukraine does not win this year. I think the first question comes to my mind: is there any minuscule chance that Ukraine can win this war this year, or at all? They can win this. I can't. I
There
can't.
was never,
I want to understand the mindset of these politicians.
well, first of all, let's just make it clear, Ukraine could never win this war, ever, under any circumstance, win this war. So that's straight up fact. Now, why would Boris Johnson say what he's saying? First of all, let's look at Boris Johnson's military pedigree. Oh, we can't because he doesn't have one. The man knows nothing about the military. He knows nothing about military art. He knows nothing about military technology, tactics, operations, strategy, nothing. He's a politician. And his job as a politician is to shape perception, even if that perception is not grounded in truth, which means his job is to lie to you to make you feel better. And that's what Boris Johnson's doing right now. He's lying to make people feel better. He is promoting something that will never occur. It's like an American politician running for office and saying that I will cut your taxes. you know, he's saying it to make you feel good, but as soon as he becomes elected in office, he's going to be looking for ways to raise your taxes because his job is to take more money away from you to feed the establishment, the deep state, the blob. Boris Johnson's a liar. He's a man with zero integrity, and he's saying things that hopefully rational people should just totally disregard because his words have no substance. His words have no meaning. They have no merit.
And in his statement, that the second, but it seems that enthusiasm in the United States as we approach the process of nomination for presidential election is going down, it's declining. How do you see this in the United States?
Well, first of all, the number of Americans, the percentage of Americans who could actually articulate the reality of what's going on in Ukraine, why we're doing what we're doing is very, very small. Simply putting a Ukrainian flag on your social media account does not make you a Ukrainian expert. It makes you somebody who apparently feels that virtue signaling is more important than actual detailed knowledge. So when you have so many people who are superficially attached to an idea, when the going gets tough, the tough get going, but everybody else starts running away. And what we're seeing right now is as the going is getting tough, where you can no longer hide behind the willing lies of the media. I mean, throughout the summer and the fall, every story you read in the media was, Russian troops are surrendering, the paratroopers' weapons are falling apart, Putin has cancer, the generals are incompetent, this, that. And if you're somebody who is intellectually lazy so that that's all you read, you're going, yeah, Russia's losing. It's the easiest victory in the world. You put a Ukrainian flag on your social media account, you turn on the internet, and you read about Russia losing, and you can feel good about yourself. You're winning. But now even the media can't lie about what's going on. And the media is saying, no, Russia's probably going to win. Suddenly that Ukrainian flag on your social media doesn't mean anything now because it's not easy. Now you have to think. Now you have to dig in. People starting to ask hard questions. What about those Nazis? Don't want to talk about that. What about the accounting for the 115 billion? Don't want to talk about that. What about Zelensky being one of the most corrupt people on the planet? Don't want to talk about that. Ukraine has suddenly become very uncomfortable for the people who were promoting Ukraine. They were promoting Ukraine out of ignorance. It just felt good to do. It was easy. Like I said, all you had to do is put that flag on there. Man, everybody's like, wow, you're a really virtuous person. You're a good person. And you could turn on the internet and feel good about your decision because there it is. Ukraine's winning. Right now, you might want to take that flag down because all it exposes you as is an idiot, a narrow-minded person who doesn't know anything about anything. The American people are starting to wake up to the fact that we've put an awful lot of money into Ukraine and we're not getting anything out of it. It's one thing to raise, allegations of, for instance, Nazi affiliations. and only to see that they don't gain traction because the media has, said the opposite about Ukraine. But now, as truths are starting to emerge, you can't ignore things that have been said in the past because they're now coming back to it. You can't ignore the videos of Ukrainians shooting prisoners of war. You can't ignore the videos of Ukrainians giving the straight arm salute. You can't ignore the past statements made by Ukrainian officials in support of Stepan Bandera. And so it's becoming very inconvenient. And I think finally in Congress, we have people who feel liberated by this fact. They feel secure now and forcefully confronting the Biden administration on their policy in Ukraine because it's becoming increasingly clear that they won't pay a price at home, that people are fed up. And I think we're starting to see that trend. It's going to transcend political parties. I think in the coming months, you're going to see Americans saying no to Ukraine, not because they suddenly think Vladimir Putin's a good guy or Russia's a great country, but because they recognize that Volodymyr Zelensky isn't a good guy and Ukraine isn't a great country, and it's not worth one more U.S. dollar or the drop of one American soldier.
Scott, how do you see the case of Trump? Because he's leading Biden. He has more votes. New polls shows that he has more votes than Biden, and he's leading ahead of DeSantis as well. Is he make his if he makes it into the office? Do you think that he's gonna change anything on the battlefield?
Well, remember, he was already in office, and he was unable to overcome congressional opposition to his desire to be friends with Russia. And the opposition wasn't just Democratic, it was bipartisan. The Republicans in Congress don't want to be friends with Russia by and large. There's a small number of them that do. And so the question is, how would Donald Trump behave in the face of such, political opposition? Would he do the right thing and tell them to stick it in their ear, pound sand, I'm going to go forward and be friends with Russia? Or would he do what he did in the past and surround himself with people from the establishment who ensured that the needs, wants, and desires of the establishment were met? They put the brakes on Trump's, innovative policies regarding NATO, North Korea, and of course, Ukraine.
Scott, Spectator, a British magazine. There is an article in this magazine. I want to quote some part of this article. It says Putin is cultivating an alliance of nations that feel victimized by Western imperialism and puts Russia at the head of it, which is not far from reality because we see the support for the US in this conflict. Not much support in Asia, in Africa, Central and South America. How do you see this part that I coded for you
Well, I agree
that I
with
read
you.
it?
I agree with the statement 100%. But it's more than just, feel victimized. Life isn't good if all you do is play the victim. Life is better when you play the role of engaged citizen. So I think a more accurate portrayal of that are nations that feel that they have a rightful place in the, around the table of global fraternity. That it's no longer a small round table with King Arthur of the United States sitting at the top and all of his knights, hand-picked knights there underneath them. This is a broader table where everybody's coming at the table and there is no head of the table. That everybody is equal, everybody has a vote, everybody has a say. And that's the table that Russia and China are setting up right now. It's very attractive to much of the world, especially those who have experienced the imperialism and the colonialism of the United States and European relationships. Russia doesn't have that kind of history, neither does China. Russia doesn't have foreign policies that are linked to the denial of support, the threat of sanctions, etc. Russia's policies are, very simple. Here's what we would like. This is what we're willing to give you for that. We've listened to your concerns. We've modified our are conditions, and here's a treaty, let's sign it. It's signed, and then Russia abides by the terms of the treaty. I mean, there's no, better thing to do than to have that kind of predictability. And that's what Russia is. It's a very predictable power. The United States and Europe, on the other hand, are very unpredictable. The only thing that we can predict is that if the United States gets involved and touches you and claims they're there to help you, you're probably going to die, because the United States isn't here to help anybody. The United States exists only to please the United States. So I think that, the notion that Russia is not going to be isolated by the majority of what we call the developing world or the newly developed world. The United States is waiting in vain, I think, for that to happen, and I don't believe that's going to happen.
And Moscow, the other they said that U.S. is preparing false flag chemical attacks in Ukraine. Do you think we're gonna have something like what happened in Syria, in Ukraine?
No, I don't. First of all, Syria had an acknowledged chemical weapons program, and then they turned that over for disposition to the Organization of Prohibition of Chemical Weapons Inspectors. What happened after there, that I think all data points to the reality that it was done by Syrian opposition to forces that were opposed to the continued rule in Syria by Bashar al-Assad. And many of these groups had extreme religious views, some linked to al-Qaeda. And these are the people that helped, they worked with the OPCW, in fact, to fabricate evidence of Syrian government use. I mean, we see them collecting soil samples from an alleged sarin nerve agent release point, wearing, at least some of them wearing chemical training suits, which provide no protection whatsoever, but they're wearing them as if this is the most dangerous place in the world. But the person walking right alongside them is wearing flip-flops with open skin. So it's a sham, it's a lie, et cetera, but the OPCW treated it as such, as real. That those situations don't exist. Russia has given up its chemical weapons. There are no chemical weapons in Russia, unlike the United States, which still retains a stockpile because we had difficulty coming up with the appropriate ecologically friendly system to dispose of these chemicals. But we have them. So Russia, you can't accuse Russia of trying to use a weapon that no longer exists in the Russian arsenal. It's gone. The current concern isn't that Russia is going to do something. It's that anti-Russian activists are going to look at the Syrian example and come up with a false flag effort to do something and then pin the evidence on Syria. I believe in Ukraine, you may have some Ukrainians who will do a false flag incident and pin the responsibility on Russia. But nobody's going to buy that. I mean, at least nobody of substance. And I include the United States in that list because we're more and more losing our gravitas. We're more and more losing our ability to engender respect on the part of, foreign leaders. So, no, I don't see a threat of chemical weapons. It could be an issue of, morbid curiosity by arms control people going forward, but there's no real threat of Russia using chemical weapons.
And how about China? It seems that this conflict that is getting worse in Taiwan, it's gonna get China and Russia much more together. It's gonna make their relations even better.
Yeah, again, go back to June 2021 when Joe Biden met with Vladimir Putin in Geneva. After their final session, Joe Biden was walking to his helicopter, I believe, and he was answering questions, and he basically said something to the effect of, Russia needs to watch out for those Chinese. They're getting ready to outproduce and make a move on the eastern territories, et cetera. It's been the goal of the United States to separate Russia and China for some time now. During the Cold War, one of the whole reasons why Richard Nixon went to China was to lure China away from the Soviet orbit. Today, I think there's a general recognition that if you can bring Russia's massive energy resources and mineral wealth, I'm talking beyond simply producing oil and gas, and marry it up with China's industrial capacity, you have the real possibility of creating an economic engine that's unbeatable. The United States simply couldn't compete with it. And apparently, American politicians aren't happy with that answer. They like to believe that America is an exceptional nation, that America is founded in the principles of manifest destiny. So it's their job to go out and expand and take over the world. This is a posture that is not sustainable at this time. It's not going to work.
Scott, I want to ask about Syria. I want to know what the U.S. is doing in Syria, what they want there.
Well, that's a good question to ask the U.S. I don't think we have a good answer for that right now. I think we had a policy of removing Bashar al-Assad from power. I think we had a policy of trying to transform the Middle East one nation at a time. And then once Russia intervened, we had a policy of checking Russian regional influence. Once Iran intervened, we had a policy of checking Iranian influence. So we seem to be reacting as opposed to being proactive. But today, what we appear to be doing is occupying space to prevent the Syrian government from, reasserting sovereign control over part of the of Syria. And we're in the unfortunate business of actually actively participating in a war crime, which is we are illegally occupying the territory of a sovereign state, and we're facilitating the theft of the resources of that state. And what I'm talking about is oil. We are helping the Kurds of that area who have organized themselves, the pro-American Kurds, into something called the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, but really they're the YPG, which is the Syrian, militant groups that are part of the PKK or Turkish Kurdish independent groups. They report to them. PKK is a terrorist organization. Turkey views it as a terrorist organization. The United States views it as a terrorist organization. It is a terrorist organization. I know they say, well, we only do that because we want, to have an independent Kurdistan, and I respect people's desire for self-determination. I'm not here to say that the Kurds could never, ever, ever have a homeland. That's their business. But the tactics they have used to try and make this happen are the tactics of terror that there's universal condemnation of. And so the United States is literally fighting on the side of terrorists against the Syrian government. But, that wouldn't be the first time. We helped arm and equip al-Qaeda in Iraq, ISIS, al-Nusra. They've all been paid and equipped and facilitated by the United States because they had expressed anti-regime sentiments against Bashar al-Assad. So we're trapped in Syria today. We're there, we're doing something, but it's alienating the Turks. Imagine that. The Turkish allies, NATO allies, are sitting here saying, why is the United States working hand in glove with anti-Turkish terrorists? And then every time we want to come in and rough the terrorists up, because we're taking a page out of the American playbook. That's all America does is go around the world and rough up organizations we claim to be terrorist in nature. So the Turks want to use the American solution on the Syrian Kurds, and America says, no, you can't do that. We won't let you do that. But to what end? Okay, I could understand if someone said, no, that's not in our interest because we want to accomplish what? There's no congressional permission for the American troops to be in Syria. It's an ongoing constitutional affront. There's no military mission beyond occasionally running down and killing an ISIS leader. But in that case, you could do that from outside the country. You don't need to have American troops illegally occupying a sovereign nation. So I think what Syria is, it's the last vestiges of a failed American effort to impose its will on the Middle East militarily. The major projects, Iraq and Afghanistan, and even Syria, have collapsed. What's left is the remnants, this last little foothold of American military power projection in the Middle East is there in northern Syria. And, hopefully the situation won't devolve such that American lives are lost or that the Americans are involved in the killing of Syrians. Hopefully, the Americans will be evicted using non-lethal means. But bottom line is we're going to have American boys and girls in harm's way for some time now until a political decision is made in Washington, D.C. to withdraw these troops. And right now, there's no desire to, because if we withdraw, that gives a victory not only to Bashar al-Assad, but to Iran and Russia. And we're not in the giving victory to Russia phase right now. We're into the oppose Russia at every step of the way phase.
I see. And the other day, one of our followers wrote in a comment. He says that it doesn't matter. US can put whatever it wants on the table in this casino in Ukraine, but they have to remember that Russia is the owner of this casino. It bears some reality in it, but the sad reality about this statement is the what is on the table is are the people of Ukraine, are
Yeah.
Ukrainians. They're dying badly every day.
Yep. I mean, look, if we're going to use the casino analogy, the traditional chips are what we'll call power chips. So we don't think of it in any other terms other than geopolitical expression, control of Ukraine, control of global grain markets, control of energy. We think things in that term. But when you take the chip, and even though it might be expressed in terms of power, what the chip is blood and bones, flesh of humans. And so you're putting chips on the table, and when you lose that bet, the chips are taken off, those are dead bodies. And the United States has been putting a lot of chips on the table, and they're losing every bet they make. And right now, the number of dead bodies is just mind-boggling. It's in the hundreds of thousands. There's disagreement on whether it's only 150,000 or could it be as much as 350,000. I believe the 350,000 number. I think it's a lot of dead Ukrainians, and it's only going to get higher. That number is going to go up even more before this is done. Most of those are soldiers, so don't cry for me, Argentina. I mean, you're in a war, and soldiers die. Surprisingly few of them are civilians. I mean, when I say surprisingly few, we're talking around 9 to 12,000. So hey, that's a big number. That's a lot of dead civilians. But historically speaking, when you fight large-scale ground combat in an environment like Europe, the correlation between civilian deaths and military deaths is about 1 to 1. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Study the history of the Normandy campaign, the liberation of France, D-Day, and what transpired afterwards. 60,000 French civilians lost their lives during that campaign. 60,000. Nobody talks about that. But we killed 60,000 French civilians to liberate France. And you don't hear anybody saying warmonger, butcher, baby killer, all that about the French and the Americans and the Canadians and the British who were doing this, because that's war. People understood that. Yet now Russia is carrying out a special military operation against Ukraine, the Ukraine that was preparing to attack the Donbass, Ukraine that had declared war on ethnic Russians in the Donbass and Crimea for years now, thousands of people dead, most of them combatants, but some of them civilians, a significant number of those being children. And the Russians are called baby killer. They're called murderer. They're committing genocide. The numbers don't lie. If Russia has killed 150 to 350,000 Ukrainian troops and only killed 9 to 12,000 Ukrainian civilians in the process, and remember, those civilian deaths, they're not coming only from what Russia's doing. Fact is, most of them probably come from what Ukraine is doing. And here you can call the Ukrainians baby killers and murderers because that's literally what they are. They use Ukrainian civilians as human shields. They put them in the basement of a building they're turning into a strong point. They put heavy equipment in residential areas, on the hopes that Russia, won't strike them. It's the Ukrainians who have gone out and carried out cleansing operations to liquidate collaborators and alleged saboteurs. They had one Ukrainian official who was linked to the Azov regiment openly bragging to a Ukrainian journalist about the need to conduct a census after this war was over because you're going to have to find out who's missing because they're all dead. We're just killing people. He said we kill them and we roll their bodies down the hill. We don't know who we're killing. So you're going to have to do a census later on to figure out. And he didn't say it with any remorse. He said it with actual glee in his heart, like he really enjoyed the killing. But that's what Banderas do. I don't know why people don't understand that Stepan Bandera's ideology is grounded in the notion of racial supremacy on the part of the Western Ukrainian, and that everybody else is subhuman, especially the Jews, especially the Poles, especially the Russians. And then from 1943 to 1944, 110,000 Poles, civilians, were killed by the Banderas. Gathered up, put into buildings, had the buildings set on fire, half to death, bodies thrown into wells to contaminate water supply. That's what they do. That's who these people are. They're not good people. And so, it's this war is just so wasteful. We're supporting the wrong side. We're on the wrong side of history. History will judge us harshly for what we've done. And I think the Ukrainian people will judge us harshly too. At some point in time, there's going to become an awakening where they realize that the United States isn't their friend, that we're the ones responsible for the deaths of everybody, that we're the ones who have empowered them to commit suicide, and that we're not serious about helping them. That's the ultimate thing. Ask anybody who's ever aligned themselves with the United States. And what happens when the going gets tough? America's gone. Ask the South Vietnamese. Ask the Afghan. Ask the Iraqis. Ask the Kurds. Now go ask the Ukrainians. It's the same story. We're willing to have you sacrifice the genetic treasure of your nation. So just think about it, what it means. 350,000 men are dead. Those are men who aren't going to be able to have children. They're done, finished. Their line's gone.
Tragic. Scott, we started with Seymour Hersh. Let's finish with another remarkable journalist, Julian Assange. He said, in the last 50 years, any single war was the result of media lies. They have to lie to fool people into wars. They're not lying on their own. They're lying on the desire of the governments. How do you see the role of media in this war in Ukraine?
If there was justice in the world, if there was justice, the mainstream American media would be treated like Nazi propagandists, meaning that they're culpable for the crimes of the Nazi regime. The American mainstream media is culpable for the crimes of the American government. We saw that in Iraq, where they helped echo the false claim about weapons of mass destruction, even though a modicum of journalistic integrity, a modicum of intellectual curiosity would have been able to produce enough data to challenge that narrative and perhaps even get the government to back down from at least a justification based upon weapons of mass destruction. But they didn't. They turned into an echo chamber. They were cheerleaders for the war, and they are singularly responsible for the nation going to war because they're the ones who made it happen. They're the ones who got the American people on board. To give you an example, again, Colin Powell. his February 5th presentation in 2003 to the Security Council of the United Nations. Every word he said was a lie. Every word he said was a demonstrable lie. And it wasn't just that the lie was in the head of people uniquely empowered to know that, like myself, who had 7 years of weapons inspection experience, but because of years of briefings and such, most of the information available to contradict what Colin Powell said was publicly available. All the media had to do is do a little bit of research, and they could have confronted the Bush administration about the lies of Colin Powell. But instead, what they did is they wrote op-eds and articles praising him, saying this is a man of integrity. When he says this is the case, we have to believe it's the case. There were journalists who said, I was skeptical about this war going in, but once Colin Powell spoke, I was on board. I'm ready to rock. That's not journalism. That's cheerleaders. Put on a skirt, get some pom-poms if you want to, but stop calling yourself a journalist. And now we take a look at what's going on in Ukraine. Everybody knows. I mean, to give you an example, before this war happened, there was story after story after story about the Nazi problem in Ukraine. Everybody knew that Ukraine had a Nazi problem, a real Nazi problem. The United States government felt so strongly about it that they would add amendments to the National Defense Authorization Act saying that no U.S. taxpayer money could be used to subsidize the Azov battalion because they were white supremacist, neo-Nazi oriented thugs. But suddenly Russia makes a move on Ukraine and all of that's forgotten. Azov gets invited into the Congress, treated like heroes, and gets to hold up flag signed by these Nazi scum. That flag gets held up in the U.S. Congress. The Speaker of the House screams out Slava Ukraina as if it's God bless America, even though it's really the war cry of the Banderas during the Volyn operation and others as they burned people to death, killed Jews. The media knows the truth. They know the truth. That's what's so frustrating about this. They know the truth. But it's not even, they're not even, saying, well, we can't tell the truth because we're scared because of this. They don't want to tell the truth because they want this war. They desperately want this war. Not because they know anything about the geopolitical ramifications of this, because this war is good business. If it bleeds, it leads. This is the ideal story. This is the equivalent, the journalistic equivalent of ambulance chasing. You see, we have a war. We have a bad guy, Russia. They're not really bad guys, but we're going to make them out to be the bad guys. We have good guys, Ukrainians, but they're really good guys. They're actually the bad guys, but we're going to make them out to be the good guys. And we're just going to make stuff up out of whole cloth. It's a democracy. How many times have you heard an American journalist call, Ukraine a democracy? There's nothing democratic about what happened, what's going on here. There's no democracy in action whatsoever right now. It's a military dictatorship, where, the commander in chief, this confused Jewish comedian has made common cause with Nazis who killed his forefathers. And he is, in over his head, declaring martial law, banning political parties, executing people, tolerating the murder of prisoner of war. He's a war criminal personified, but we're selling him as the modern day incarnation of Winston Churchill, and to show you the stupidity of this, normally the media is supposed to be sort of like a reality check. So like if a politician goes out there and says something really stupid, the media goes, whoa, what you said was really stupid. We're going to ask you questions about it until you acknowledge that it was really stupid and you change your answer. Nancy Pelosi, after Zelensky addressed the Congress, said that was the greatest speech in the history of the United States Congress. The greatest speech in the history of the United States Congress was delivered by a Ukrainian comedian. At the same time, he was handing off an autographed flag representing, the Azov regiment. And the media is silent in terms of opposition. They're cheering so hard right now. So they're war criminals. They literally are. They are propaganda. And, it's interesting. They this week they published a list from the Office of the Ukrainian President, the Center for Countering Disinformation list, CCD. And I have to say, I'm number one. I am literally the number one threat to Ukraine in terms of, information. They're calling me an information terrorist, a Russian propagandist. They've marked me for death for telling the truth. And, so it's ironic that if you tell the truth about this conflict, you get threatened with death, or you get threatened with being canceled. But if you're willing to tell the lies, you get high ratings, you get access to mainstream media, you get the money that comes with that. They reward the lies. This is a very sick system right now. Thank God for people like Seymour Hersh. Thank God for people like Julian Assange. The sooner we can get Julian Assange out of prison, back to his family and back to work, the better off we'll all be.
Thank you so much, Scott, for everything. And big hug from here, from Brazil. Grande abraço. You
Thank
have to
you.
learn this, Scott.
Well, I'll try. Look, I get in trouble. I went to a celebration at the Russian embassy the other day. It was Defender of the Fatherland Day. People, people are like, why would you go to the Russian embassy? And I'm like, why wouldn't I? It's the number one problem facing America today, relations between the United States and Russia. And the only way I've ever learned to overcome these difficulties is by sitting down and talking to people. And I'm an arms control guy. That's my specialty. I love arms control. I believe in arms control. And one of the big controversies right now is the New START Treaty. Do you know that the Russian ambassador, Anatoly Antonov, was the lead Russian negotiator for the New START Treaty? So why wouldn't I want to go to the embassy and have a conversation with this guy? Did you know that General Yevgeny Bobkin, the defense attaché, is a strategic rocket missile guy who actually stood up the first SS-25 road mobile missile regiment in 1986. The SS-25 was the missile I inspected when I was in Vodkinsk. Road mobile missiles are a key component to any future and current arms control agreement. Why wouldn't I want to talk with him? Why wouldn't I want to talk to the Russian officers about what's going on in Ukraine, about their perceptions of U.S.-Russian relations? This was an opportunity to get a PhD in U.S.-Russian relations. So you're darn tootin' right I went there to participate. But I did a toast with the Russian
I saw that.
and yes, and I've been condemned on that like you wouldn't believe. People are like, oh, how dare you do that? And I'm like, no, this is how we solve the problem. I'll give you an example. In 1992, when I was a weapons inspector in Iraq, we were doing an inspection up in the Mosul area, and very controversial inspections, very confrontational inspections. And at that time, the Iraqi government had basically, they were organizing demonstrations for against the UN. So we were out, we had just come back from an inspection, and we were in this hotel, and some of my inspectors were going down to eat dinner, and I was going down to eat dinner. And this giant demonstration comes in, and they surround us, and they're shouting, they're screaming, and some of my inspectors were trapped. We had to fight our way through to get them to safety. But we were sitting eating, and there was a father who was holding up his daughter who was spitting at us, and they were encouraging her to spit. She was crying because she didn't want to do it. But there's the security guys encouraging this, and they're looking at us. We know what's going on, and we were angry, but our meal was ruined, so we had to retreat and get back to our room. About an hour later, knock on the door. It was one of the Iraqi officials, and he said, "We apologize for what happened. That got out of control. That's not what we wanted to do. And we would like to invite you to come down and finish your meal." And I said, okay. So we came down. Now you're thinking, Scott, why would you want to eat with these guys? They just disrupted your meal. They just spat at you. The human thing would have been, hell no, get out of here. I'm done with you. I don't want to talk with you anymore. We went down to the restaurant. We weren't eating in the restaurant. We were invited out to the outdoor area where the Iraqi officials ate. They invited us to their table. And again, people say, why would you want to sit down and eat with the head of the Ba'ath Party of Mosul? Why would you want to sit down and break bread with the general commanding the area, with all these senior people, with the head of the intelligence people who just attacked you? Why would you want to do that? And the answer is, why wouldn't I want to do that? Because my job isn't to promote confrontation. My job is to encourage debate, dialogue, and discussion to improve relations. And we sat there that night, and we had honest conversations, man to man, human to human, where we put it all on the table. about where we stood on things. I learned so much about them, and I believe they learned stuff about me, and it led to the kind of trust that allowed us to go forward and try and fix, the problems, try and solve this disarmament thing. So anytime somebody tells me, you shouldn't be meeting these people, you shouldn't be doing this, I say, no, actually I should, and so should you. Every time, and I would say that's a lesson for everybody. If you got a neighbor you don't like, invite them out for a beer. Sit down and learn something about this person. Find out what's the root cause of the problem that exists there. And maybe you can find a way to fix it and make your life a better life. Talk is always better than not. And so I don't know why I said that, but I don't know where we were going on
Great
this.
story.
But, I just think humans interacting with humans is the solution. It's not the problem. It's the solution.
Thank you for being what you are. what you,
Well, thanks.
what you already are. That's so great to talk with you, Scott. And big
Well,
hug
thank
from
you. Thanks for
Brazil.
having me. Okay. What's that word again? Grande what?
Grande
Grande
abraço.
abraço. Grande abraço.
Yes, that's right.
Oh, that's why I was telling the story, because they took this video, and my wife's been trying to teach me Russian for 31 years. And so here's my big moment with two Russian colonels, and I say, na zdorovye. Totally wrong thing to say. I think I was supposed to say za vasha zdorov, meaning to your health, but I said something about na to health in general or something like that. And even the Russian colonel next to me looked at me and started laughing because he knew I fumbled the line. So my ability with foreign language is about zero, but at least I try.
No, but you did a good one right now.
Okay.
Thank you so much.